what do you have to say about the Jātakas?
Okay, I was saying that the tales were written from the standpoint of the Bahamas, like based on their beliefs and their like religious, like moral code.
What beliefs? Let's just be specific about
And
this.
like
Not specifically, or specifically, not specific.
they're not being greedy.
Okay, but no, let's go for something a little bit more general. What are we talking about here? What religion is this?
Buddhism?
Yes, very good. This is important. Buddhism. I think that's spelled right.
Yeah.
So we're going from Hinduism to Buddhism, both coming out of South Asia, specifically modern India, or at that point ancient India. But this is an evolution, essentially, of the same basic religious code. Sure, that's a good word. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. So it tells a story about Bodhisattva, like a Buddha to be, who was born in a holy city in India, in a caste group from which Hindu hereditary priests and scholars are born, that they're responsible for like teaching and maintaining sacred knowledge. In order for him to become a Buddhist, like he have to like die and like reborn again to kind of like cleanse his like bad karmic energy. So he died like many times, and when he died, he first was reborn as a golden goose. And well, he was married. Before he died, he was married. He was a man and he was married to this woman. They had 2 kids. And then when he died, his wife and his kids was taken in by like people in the village to be taken care of. And then he realized that they was obviously living the life that they were living when he was alive. He was like, okay, I'm going to give them one of my golden feathers, so that way that they can like provide a life for themselves. And his wife, being a greedy person that she was, decided that she wanted to take all of his feathers. She tried to convince their 3 daughters to like, I guess attack him in a sense and like pluck all his feathers. But they were like, no, we don't want to do that. Like that's wrong. And she was like, oh well, I'm still gonna do it. So she like captured him one day and like plucked all his feathers from him. And then she kept him in a barrel like bound. I was like feeding him and thinking, okay, he's gonna grow back his golden feathers. We have feathers for eternity. But when his feathers like grew back, they were like normal, regular feathers. And she didn't kind of think about that, I guess, in a sense. And then when he was like strong enough, he kind of like left. And she kind of like went back to being the life that she had before, nothing. Because she was so greedy, but she didn't know that if she just lived like 1 a day, like he was given to her, she would have had feathers forever.
Yeah.
But she didn't think that way.
That's a fun story.
Yeah.
I like this story. Let me push back on one thing you said. You said that the Buddha, when he died, he came back as this goose, or he came back as a guy, and then came back as a goose. And you seem to make that like a first thing. That I don't believe is the case. I believe the collection of little stories here, all these and they're little poems actually, is to be seen as a biography of the Buddha, of the figure who was the first Buddha. And this is just stories of his incarnation in various forms. It's not necessarily that sequential where, okay, he died and this is the first story he pops up in. This is just the first story in the collection that we have, and this one is actually fairly deep in, I believe, into the whole thing. There are, I believe, something like 500 something stories. I got 547 individual little stories. And each one has this conceit of the Buddha was reincarnated as X and does this. This happens to him, people react to him in different ways, and in the end, he tends to come out, not necessarily ahead, but he comes out sort of as the hero of the situation. But it's a charming little story. Now, it's fairly recognizable, is it not?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's the Aesop's Fables, where there's a selection earlier on in our book I believe it takes the form of the goose who laid the golden egg, a different sort of child's form story of it. And these stories in this genre are pretty common, where you come across a lot of talking animals, where there are fairly simple moralistic lessons to be learned, and they're the sorts of things that grandmothers of all ages pull their grandkids along and say, now you remember this story, and it teaches basic concepts of right and wrong and moral principles. The Jātakas aren't quite that. The stories that they lay out are really fairly simple. Now, the Golden Goose one is one of the simpler ones in terms of understanding. There aren't that many characters to keep track of. It's not that long. It's an adorable little story with a fairly simple moral to get at. What is the moral?
Don't be greedy.
Yeah, don't be greedy. Simple. It's not all that hard to see. Along the way, of course, it's slipping in other things like if you had to say who is the bad guy in this story. The woman! Well, we've certainly never seen that before. They're striking new ground there. The wife is not just greedy, but noticeably a wife. And, kind of an ex-wife at that. That never goes well. Well, she's the widow. As time went on, his feathers grew again, and he flew away to his own abode and never came back again. That's an interesting little twist on the ending.
I think that he was hurt. Right?
Yeah.
I think that the fact that to come back and to still want to take care of your family, you know what I mean? Like, it kind of says about how that he was. In fact, took advantage of him. Like, why would he stick around?
Yeah.
Why would he stick around?
Yeah. It's very easy to say that, well, she kind of had that coming. But what you're essentially cheering for here is, well, he did there abandon his family.
But he tried.
He tried. Give him credit.
Yes.
He wanted to help his family, and he tried. Why would that be punished by fate?
I guess that he should have stuck around for the long term, like regardless, even if he tried and she took advantage of him.
He should stick around more?
I guess to them.
To whom?
To I guess to the Buddhists again, to like their views is like regardless, that he still be selfless, even if she hurted him.
What would selflessness mean?
To stay.
To stay.
Yeah.
To stay with his family.
Yeah. But I don't believe that he should have stayed. I agree with him.
What prompts him initially to go back after he is dead and reincarnated as this goose? What prompted him initially to come back and help them?
Because they were suffering.
How so?
Because to me, I felt like they were living a different life. When he was around, he did take care of them. Being the man of the house, she was a wife, so clearly she probably wasn't working, especially in that time. She obviously was just being at home, taking care of the kids, cooking, cleaning, whatever. He's bringing all of
The Real Housewives of wherever the hell they are.
Right, so the fact that he died shouldn't have the same quality of life that she had when he was around.
Yeah.
It's like, you know what, I'm back, I could give her something that could help her.
It says very explicitly, discovering that his wife and daughters were living on charity of others, the goose bethought him of his plumage like hammered and beaten gold. It was almost a little bit of an ego thing there that, my widow and my kids, they're living on charity. What does that say about me? And that, always go back to the text, that one sentence gives you his motivation. He wanted to correct that situation. He wanted to, for whatever reason, concern for them, concern for his own reputation, he wanted to reinvest in his family. He had I wonder if I should just go for this term, but sure, I will, an attachment to them.
family.
It's his family. Sure, it's perfectly understandable. How does it turn out?
She took advantage of it.
She took advantage of it. That was the consequence of him acting. Actions and consequences. The same basic conundrum that you see in Hinduism. But here it's taking it a little bit further. His actions are almost entirely negative. They're negative in the effect of it inspired this greediness, and they are negative in the initial motivation because it's coming from a place of ego. It doesn't say, he loved them so much he wanted to help. It says he felt bad that they were having to live on charity. You can imply, or you can infer rather, that that is tied up with love. But it doesn't say that right there. So all you have is a corrupt motivation and a corrupt consequence to the action. What should he have done upon dying then? What does the story suggest he should have done?
Just not help them in that way.
Yeah. Do nothing. Fly away. You can make the argument that, well, he lived his life as a farmer, he did what he could, he left them what he could, and his job is done now. And now he gets to leave. And in fact, the ending, when it says, and he flew away to his own abode and never came back again. He flew away to his own home. He is going home. That is a happy ending of sorts. So all that helping his family stuff in the beginning, or in the middle, was a distraction. It was an impediment. It was what was getting in the way of him going home and achieving this happy ending, his own abode. So you see how even just the simplest little story starts to get a little bit more complicated. As you dwell on it, you realize, wait, there's some weird stuff going on here. The details start to nudge you in different directions. Because this isn't just a little, Goldilocks and the Three Bears type story. There's some subtlety going on here. There's some complications implied that the minute you start to lean in on them, they start to bring you more consideration. Daniel, are you just doing semaphore, or what's going on with the hands here? Okay. I didn't know if you were if you had something to say. Okay, that's fine. And the whole idea of it being a bit of a journey that gets distracted from time to time is implied in the very term, the Bodhisattva. He is becoming the Buddha, so to speak. It is a process of continual evolution. So it's not just, wherever he ends up is arbitrary. It's no, wherever he ends up is better. So you have to look at the trajectory. How does he get to that point? What does he have to do? Where does he go wrong along the way, and how is it corrected? So there's a certain teleological arc to every story where you look at the end and you see, okay, that's the good thing. He's making progress towards his goal of becoming enlightened. How do we get there? What are the little steps or missteps along the way? And in doing this, people can sit there and study this story, which is very cute and charming in its own little respect, and get hints for their own behavior. Now again, we're up against that same construct of, if all consequences are bad or all actions are bad, isn't even thinking about these things bad? Shouldn't you just act without thinking? Is that possible? No. But it's a goal. It's the ambition. If you want to be like me, the perfect one, the enlightened one, you will do this. Because I can do it. Why can't you? What's holding you back? Why are you so limited? It's complicated. But this is a way of spreading a belief system in a relatively accessible way. It's less dense than a lot of religious texts because it has this, these little animal stories that are, again, they're adorable. They're easy to remember. They're charming. And they give you little nuggets of lessons along the way in the way that all children's stories do. But within them, if you have the capacity to dwell on them just a little, to dig in just a little bit more, it can start to spread its dogma. But that's part of what makes it fun. If it was just a kid's story, I can sit down and I can watch all sorts of Disney movies with my kids, and they get transported on the, princesses and magic and all that stuff, and oh boy, it's a talking magical creature. But I sit back and I watch the same stuff, and I say, yeah, okay, that's an interesting, and okay, what does that character represent, and what can I see into that action? Oh, well, of course that happened, but by doing that, it really represents the social structure as a whole, and that's where the real fun of stories tends to lie, at least for me. But, I'm boring. I know this about myself. I'm okay. Tell me about the hare's self-sacrifice.
Okay, so this tale tells the story of self-sacrifice. So the Bodhisattva was born as a hare. He lived in a beautiful forest that bordered a village with his 3 friends, a monkey, a jackal, and an otter. They looked to the wise hare as their leader. He taught them morality and how to give to others is an act of virtue. With the holiday approaching, the hare told his friends that if someone asked them for food, they were to give freely and generously from the food they had gathered for themselves. On that day, the 4 friends separated to find food. The otter found 7 red fish on a riverbank. The jackal found the lizard and a vessel of curdled milk someone had abandoned. The monkey gathered mangoes from the trees. The animals made sure that the food didn't belong to anyone else. The Bodhisattva is trying to figure out what's the most fulfilling meal he can offer a beggar. And then he thought, why not offer himself instead of the grass? So the Saka, which to me is like a mighty god, he took the form of a Brahman, decided to test the hare's goodness to see if he was good or bad, whatever. So he first tested the otter. He offered the Brahman the 7 fish he had gathered for his own meal. Then the jackal, he offered the Brahman the lizard and curdled milk he had planned to have for his own meal. And the monkey offered the Brahman the mangoes he had looked forward to eating himself. Then the Brahman went to the hare and asked for food, but the hare had no food but the grass growing in the forest. He told the Brahman to build a fire, and when the fire was burning, he said, I have nothing to give you to eat but myself. Then the hare threw himself onto the fire, not before he shook his body in order to get rid of all the insects so they would not burn to death as well. So the Saka, still disguised as the Brahman, was astonished and deeply moved. He caused the fire to go instantly cold so that the hare was not burned, and then revealed his true form to the selfless little hare. Then he said, And dear hare, your virtue will be remembered through the ages. And then the Saka painted the wise hare's likeness in the pale face of the moon for all to see. The Saka returned to his home to Mount Meru, and the 4 friends lived long and happily in the beautiful forest. And to this day, those who look at the moon can see the image of the selfless hare.
Yeah. It's a nice little story. You have many different kinds of animals. They're all getting along. They're friends. Isn't that nice? Animals are always so wild in the way they, hunt and eat one another. But here they're all friends, and it's like a Disney movie. But I think we can say with some confidence that the rabbit here, the hare, takes Xenia to a whole new level in terms of hospitality. You're really going above and beyond the call when you say, well, I didn't get to go to Costco today. I got nothing to nosh on, so I'm going to immolate myself, and you can eat my charred flesh. That's something. There's a lot going on here. It's a little bit longer than the Golden Goose story, and it's a little harder to follow at certain points. So that to me is another indication that whenever I start scanning, okay, yeah, what is going on here? Whenever I personally have that problem trying to follow something, if it's starting to get a little complicated, I assume that I am being sort of pushed back for a reason. And the reason is I am not smart enough to keep up with it. So this is another indication that this is not just a little children's story. It's adorable, but it's really for very serious people. The bit at the end of the impressing the image of the rabbit on the moon is common to many cultures. It's a legendary story in the East that on the face of the moon people will sometimes see an outline of a rabbit. So this is another example of an etiology where, well, you're just looking around and you see the world is a certain way, and you come up with little stories and legends to fulfill that. And this is sort of doing that in that same direction in a very, again, sort of charming and culturally specific way, a way that, transcends multiple cultures across Asia. But here, the core is, again, this notion of sacrifice. You could say that in the Golden Goose story, the Bodhisattva was sacrificing his feathers. He is giving of himself. And here you have a hare, a rabbit, who, when he has nothing else to give, offers the only thing he has left, his body. Now we know that the physical presence in a reincarnation system, the physical presence is seen as somewhat of, just an old set of clothes that you can cast off at any time and trade in for new ones. So the stakes are relatively low for that. He's not necessarily self-destroying, but he is shucking off that. And I think, I think it's fair to say as well that by jumping into a fire, whether that is the end of his existence entirely as a soul or not, those first few minutes in the fire are going to hurt. And that is obviously an act of some devotion, some sacrifice. I am willing to take this on for the greater good because it is the proper thing to do. But this notion of sacrifice is another example of renunciation of people, ordinary people, and their power to exercise religious devotion. Because remember, in a highly structured society where the Brahmas are up top, this is a priestly class. They control access to religion. And to democratize that a little bit, you teach individuals that they can participate in religion on their own through renouncing. Because priests at the time in this particular culture would be known as people who would make sacrifices to God, largely animal sacrifices. You know, you bring a cow up on the altar or something like that. Cow is probably not the right one. But you bring an animal up on the altar, you slaughter it, and it nourishes the gods in some respects. The Greeks do this at the drop of a hat. You see it all over. But here, you can see that power being dispersed a little bit, because the problem with that model, where in order to participate in the religion, you are just giving over your agency to the priest, who is then a gatekeeper to access to God. That is a very centralized authority. But here you can see a nudge in the other direction, where if people can make symbolic sacrifices, sacrifices of themselves, by renouncing stuff and saying, I can't sacrifice an animal, I don't have that much money, but perhaps if I, eat less, or give up my favorite food, or, not go to Starbucks every day. I know, that one's hard to swallow. By renouncing, you are proving that you have that capacity, that agency within a spiritual structure. So it is a broadening approach to spirituality that doesn't go through a bottleneck priestly system. So you can see how this is a somewhat revolutionary concept, because it's rubbing against the central authority of the time. But sacrifice comes up again in the next one. Tell me about the monkey's heroic self-sacrifice. 2 stories in a row with monkeys. I like monkeys. Monkeys are good. You have a story with a monkey, I'm there.
Okay, so this tale tells how the monkey saved history. So the Bodhisattva was born as a monkey. He was the leader of like 80,000 monkeys in the Himalaya. There was a mango tree on the bank of a great river. The fruit fell from some of the branches of the tree into the river, and from other branches it fell on the ground. The Bodhisattva was worried that danger might come to them if the mango drops into the river and humans find it and, I guess, eat it or whatever. They can bring danger to the monkeys. The monkeys were clever in the gathering of the mangoes so as not to leave any hanging over the river. But one day, a mango that was hidden by an ant's nest fell into the river. On that day, the king of the country stood on the bank of the same river, but many miles below where the mango tree grew. The king was watching the fishermen with their nets. As they drew in their nets, the fishermen found not only fishes but a strange fruit. They went to the king with the strange fruit. They tasted the fruit and thought it was very good. They decided to go in search of this fruit tree. The king had many rafts joined together, and they went up the river until they came to the place where the mango tree grew. They found the mango tree. The king and all the men with him gathered the mangoes that lay on the ground under the tree. They decided to stay overnight to gather more mangoes. After the men fell asleep, the monkey and the Bodhisattva went picking and eating the mangoes. They made so much noise that they woke up the king. The king ordered his troops to shoot the monkeys and have them for breakfast alongside the mangoes. The monkeys saw the archers standing around with their arrows ready to shoot. Fearing death, the monkeys ran to the chief, the Bodhisattva, for him to save them. The Bodhisattva did exactly that. He ran out on the branch of the mango tree that hung out over the river. The long branches of the tree across the river did not quite meet the branch he stood on. He knew if the monkeys tried to jump across, they would fall in the water. So he made a bridge with his back. They ran along the branch, stepped on his back, then ran along the branch of the other tree. They swung themselves down to the ground and away they went back to their home. The king saw all that was done by the Bodhisattva for his truth. The king was astonished by the Bodhisattva's selflessness and made sure the monkey was taken care of for the rest of his life. The monkey died, I guess, like a king in a sense, and was given like this beautiful king burial, and then he finally became like a Buddhist, like after that last death. Yeah.
Okay, very good. The it's another sacrifice story,
Yeah.
self-sacrifice. The monkey, the king of the monkeys. I call my youngest daughter a monkey, so you know, it has all sorts of funny associations with me. The king of the monkeys sacrifices himself and lets his subjects, his people, his fellow monkeys, run across his back to safety. And he does this for who, in front of whom? The earthly king, the human king, who's just, you know, a doofus out looking for a snack. Oh, mangoes are good. I want more of those. And so he is willing to, for his selfish physical indulgence, I'm assuming he has other food to eat, but he is going into this forest and chasing down this particular fruit that he's never had before and is so good, just out of his own, you know, physical lust for it. And he watches the monkey do this, and he's impressed by that. So when the monkey dies, he orders immediately that this, you know, massive state funeral be given and all of the glories bestowed upon the monkey. And he celebrates him. And in fact, that taking it as a relic raised a shrine, he honored it with incense and garlands all his life, and established in the Bodhisattva's teaching, he did alms and other good deeds, and ruling his kingdom righteously became destined for heaven. So it wasn't just that, you know, he thought, wow, that was a nice thing the monkey did. But by correcting his own behavior and drawing lessons from this example, he is able to correct his own behavior, perhaps learn something about a king's dharma, his duty to his subjects, as opposed to just pursuing his own physical pleasures, serving the people he is supposed to be leading. On page 1302, right in the middle of this thing, the monkey basically sings a little song to him, tells the story, and they have it inset as separate couplets here. The whole thing is supposed to be a poem, but here it's set off to be like a distinct one that that the monkey himself is saying. And he says, "A parable for thee, O king, if thou the truth wouldst read, the happiness of kingdom and of armies and of steed and city must be dear to thee if thou wouldst rule indeed." Which by its old-timey phrasing, wouldst, now again, translation, whatever, but clearly this is supposed to be somewhat archaic language, and the fact that they are setting it off even further as a poem within a poem, it's supposed to be very timeless in its antiquity. But he also explicitly calls it a parable. A parable isn't just a story. A parable is a story that's supposed to be interpreted and to not drive a core message, but needs to be reinterpreted for a meaning within the story. And that's what all of these are supposed to do. So here the monkey is saying, The story I just told you, which is the story of everything that just happened, is a parable and needs to be interpreted, needs to be drawn out. And that you, as a king, would do well to listen to it, to think about it, and to amend your behavior, and then the city, or then basically everything is going to go well for you. You are going to have a good reign as king. And I want you to think also, the monkey is the bodhisattva. He is on the path of being enlightened, of becoming a Buddha. He is instructing a king. Which class is the king likely from? The highest class?
No, the higher class then.
Of the ones that they have here.
But no, he will be below because the priest is the highest.
Yes.
He's like, meet him. But he would think that.
He's a warrior. He is a king, is supposed to be a political leader. Somebody goes out and conquers other territories and defends their territory in turn. The people writing and promoting this work of literature, probably the priests, the Brahmins. And here you have a setup where the monkey, who is the Buddha figure here, the top dog of the priests, is laying out very explicitly, if you want to be a successful king, if you want to be known as a good king, do what I do, follow my example, bend to my authority, the authority of my example, the authority of my integrity. Fashion your actions after me. And that is the top of that pyramid, arguing down, not just to the king, but to everyone else. Mahaya.
Professor, I have a question.
Shoot!
So, in this two literature of work, it shows that the kings are in warrior section. But the other work of literature, like for example the Odyssey, it shows that kings are like the highest. So,
There are
how come these two literature allowed kings to be in second position of the pyramid versus they allowed some other people, because king has more authority and they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, I would argue that the basic structures, you're right, they're the kings, in a sense, the kings in the Greek tradition, in the Odyssey and the Iliad and even up through the classical Athenian era, the kings are usually outranking the priests. In the beginning of the Iliad, the priest Calchas comes up to the king Agamemnon and says, or not Chryses. Sorry, there's a priest named Chryses whose daughter has been kidnapped by Agamemnon, and he wants her back, and he has to beg Agamemnon for this. And the power dynamic is very clear. Agamemnon has all the power. The priest is nothing. Here you see a priestly caste well established over it. I would say that this is, at the time, a more sophisticated culture with a much more rigid social dynamic. The Iliad and the Odyssey, and for quite some time thereafter, and it's hard to really compare the two because we're dealing with vastly different chunks of time, and not even specific outlines of when these things came about. But the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey was much more tribal, was much more barbaric, much more warlords. The word king has very little meaning in a Greek tradition. Basileus is the word, but it means essentially warlord. So there is no centralized authority like we're dealing with here.
Yeah, because in the beginning with the tale of cinema, that one kind of resembles the king as if he's the god.
Yeah.
So versus now we're talking like a king, but not even in the higher status of the society, but they're in the second.
Could it be that it's just like two different systems? Like in one system, the highest like person is the king, and then the other system, the highest like people are the Brahmins. It's just
Sure.
Like, the names, right? Are they too tied to names?
No, because like even in Indian culture, they really follow this structure still, like till the word. Like whoever is Brahman, they're like very highest in the social.
It's much more rigid. A lot of it is also just, who is writing the rules. If, in the case of, you bring up Himta Aten, the king was largely dictating how that power structure would work. Where sure, there is a divine presence, and the only way you're going to know him is to go through me. Which is essentially what the Brahmins are saying here. And here they are the ones who are promoting this structure. There is a fixed amount of divinity in the world. We have a monopoly on all of it. You cannot access it without us. Therefore, you should worship us as near gods ourselves. It's complex. You can see these human motivations buried in these stories that, as old as this stuff can be, as foreign as it can seem, the human motivations are always there, beating just below the surface, and all you have to do is scratch at it a little. You can pass through. There's some enormously complex social factors that are getting passed over, and the names and the backstories for everything just go on forever, and you can really drown in all that. But underneath, you can see these basic human passions and ambitions struggling from culture to culture. And in different iterations, it's going to take different forms, but it's always the same. We see it again and again. In the power structure, how many times have we seen different versions of restrain yourself? The story with the golden goose is saying restrain yourself. Don't take pity on your family. They're going to be fine without you. Detach yourself from that investment and move on to the next phase of your life or your existence, afterlife. And restraining yourself, you can apply to everything we've read in the ancient era. Restrain yourself. The world is getting complicated. The world is filling up. There are way too many people around here for us all to be bumping into one another and thinking we have the right to do so. Restrain yourself so that you can function in society, so that the people at top don't have to deal with all the fighting. They can worry about more elevated things, but also just because you can't survive if everybody's fighting all the time. A culture where everybody's at war isn't a culture for long. It's just chaos. And that's what they're fighting against. They all have a living memory of chaos. And they're trying to create a society that keeps it at bay. And they can do that through very arcane philosophical ideas, or through very simple stories of talking animals and magical creatures. All of it is driving the same basic message, though. The ancient era is trying to get away from barbarianism and figure out a way to move forward. And that you see here as well as anywhere else.